Good morning, everyone. Welcome to uh, the last opening plenary session of this year's LEPH conference in Philadelphia. We're delighted you could join us. We are meeting at what at least some people believe is an inflection point for policing and public health, though whether it is a point of intersection or divergence remains an open question. One of our panelists today has written that there is an acute need for major reform in policing in North America, and especially in the United States. Our panelists today can say more about whether this observation also applies in Europe, in Africa, in Oceania, or even in Canada. Is the impetus and the vision for change in law enforcement and public health general, or does it vary from context to context? And what about health? Does health drive this change in any sense, politically, conceptually, intellectually, in research terms? And how does health need to change as a practice and a frame for social action in human security? Well, whether this is an important moment for policing and public health remains to be seen, but the LEPH conference is certainly an important opportunity for this enterprise, which sits somewhere between a professional field and a social movement. And we have with us today 4 important thinkers in law enforcement and public health, whose reputations precede them, whose bios are available online. So I'm just going to get them started. Dan Jones, Francesca Menichelli, Augie van Dijk, and Brandon Del Pozo will speak in that order, each for 15 minutes or less, which should leave us at least 20 minutes for audience discussion. When it's time for questions, please raise your hand and we will open up your mic as your turn comes. But to satisfy the multitaskers and to make sure that any other points are registered, please do feel free to make liberal use of the chat function during the presentations. So with no further ado, Dan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much, Professor Burris. And I'd like to just thank the Global Law Enforcement Public Health Association for inviting me to be here. We start looking at the concept of law enforcement public health. We start looking at the concept of police reform. And if I'm honest, I think the concept of police reform is tired. I think we need to move to the evolution of policing. In 1991, a lot of us watched a video of Rodney King being assaulted by Los Angeles Police Department members. And I kept hearing in 1991 that reform was necessary. In 2020, all of us likely watched a video of George Floyd being murdered very, very openly and vividly on TV, and people started talking again about police reform. Why are we still having the same conversations that many years apart? People of color are dying, and we talk about police reform. And, you know, as we start looking through all of this and the concept of policing and public health and law enforcement, not in the middle of all of this, there was a thing that's still going on called COVID-19, a pandemic. And in the middle of that, there's another one called the opioid crisis, where people are dying at exponential rates of substance use disorder. And we keep trying to arrest our way out of these circumstances. We keep trying to police our way out of these circumstances in the way that we always have. And we need to start thinking, why is it not working? And you start looking at the concept of health and public health. And, you know, Chief Dale McPhee, my chief of police, says oftentimes, we need to take the police out of justice and public health out of health, put them together and make them a single entity, working with our community agencies towards community safety and well-being. And I wholeheartedly agree with that position. We, in recruit classes and police academies across the globe, we teach our members about law. We teach them how to arrest and control, and teach the concept of command and control. We teach the need for, as Daniel Kahneman would talk about, systems one thinking, doing things fast. But very rarely in policing do we need to do things fast. That's probably 4 to 5% of our day. We need to think about things slowly, and we need to think about things in a way that's not just a Band-Aid. We need to move beyond the Band-Aid of policing. We need to move beyond the, we're going to do it just good enough for right now. So I'm very fortunate. I'm going to give myself a plug here. I have actually a paper coming out in the Police Journal. It's in press right now with Dr. Sandra Basarius and Dr. Tempetope Oriola on this exact topic. And one of the things in our papers that we looked at is the social determinants of health as listed out by the Public Health Agency of Canada as income and social issues, employment and working conditions, education and literacy, childhood experience, physical environments, social supports and coping skills, healthy behaviors, access to health services, biology and genetic endowment, gender, culture, race, and racism. Interestingly enough, Caruso wrote in 2017, the social determinants of crime is poverty, domestic violence or abuse, housing, cultural and familial background, level of education, cultural characteristics, mental health, age, gender, social environments, and physical environments. These are absolutely, maybe they may not be the same words, but they're 100% linked. Larry Sherman once said in a presentation in Cambridge that we teach the police about law and then expect them to manage crime. I would go beyond that and say we teach the police about law and expect them to manage crime and offending behavior. What we don't do is teach the police about who the justice client is. What we don't do is teach the police about the social determinants of crime and health. And what we need to do is move beyond that and understand our role as police officers in the health field and in the concept of public health, and understand that we're dealing with health crises, and these health crises are often impossibly solved by the use of laws and incarceration. In my own research, I have researched the victim offender overlap, and I'm part of at the University of Huddersfield, the University of Cambridge, in collaboration with the University of Alberta Prison Project. We've interviewed over 800 incarcerated people. And in those 800 incarcerated people, we can tell you that 96% of the women that are incarcerated and 95% of the men that are incarcerated have experienced violent victimizations. We can say that 84% of the women and 83% of the men experience those violent sexual victimizations prior to their first detected offense. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about health issues. When we look at health, and we every single police officer, likely in Canada and probably all across the world, takes first aid. We teach people that you need to wear gloves, masks, and make sure that you don't infect them and they don't infect you because of the potential of viruses. We currently are in the middle of a pandemic, and every one of us is wearing these masks right now. 0.06% of the population in Canada has HIV, 0.006% of the population has hepatitis C, and 2.17% of the Canadian population has tested positive for COVID-19. Except for we use these universal precautions as a way to make sure that we are safe and the individuals that we are administering first aid to are safe. What we haven't taught our police officers is that we should use universal precautions for trauma, that we should understand that trauma is the leading cause of criminality. And oftentimes criminality is a symptom of that trauma, and oftentimes substance use disorder is a symptom of trauma. This isn't an excuse. I'm not saying that we shouldn't hold people accountable for their actions, and please don't take me wrong. What this is an understanding of who we're dealing with and why we're dealing with these individuals and how we should deal with them differently. There is going to be opportunities, and there should be opportunities for off-ramping. We should be working with our community partners, ensuring that our community partners don't work from 7 o'clock till 5 o'clock and anything after 5 o'clock p.m. on a weekday and every weekend becomes the responsibility of the police. What we need to do is work with our community partners and make sure that they are there when we are there, that we can have an opportunity to do soft handoffs and take individuals to where they need to be. One of the concepts that I think is very important is we talk about the golden rule, treat people as you want to be treated. How about the platinum rules, treat people how they need to be treated? We need to take policing and public health and blend them to a level where we have the opportunity to off-ramp people. We have the opportunity to ensure people get the help they need. In my own research, one of the most tragic stories, and I talk about it often, is a woman who was 34 years old and had never had a criminal record in the past. Historic sexual violence in her life was tragic and constant. And as a result of that, she was using substances to numb her pain. She walked into a bank with a fake handgun that looked pretty real, robbed it, waited for the police to arrive, got arrested, pled guilty on the first appearance, asked for a 5-year sentence. She heard that she could get cognitive behavior therapy within prison walls. She had been on a list outside in the community for 3 years, unable to get treatment that she required. She robbed a bank to get treatment. That is absolutely foul and wrong. Individuals need to have options for treatment, and that's where we need to be advocates. We can't look at treatment for things like substance use disorder as a linear abstinence-based treatment program. We need to look at it as as options where people can actually address the root causes of their criminality, where people can address their trauma, and where people can not go through the revolving door of prison. When we look at concepts like remand, 1 to 14 days, people go to jail for 1 to 14 days, and in 1 to 14 days, all we really do is interrupt any positive in their life. We need to look at concepts of what conditions are we putting on people. When we decide that, well, you're now getting released, but here's a condition to no longer consume alcohol or use substances, how do we figure, from a policing and a justice perspective, that we have the power to cure someone's substance use disorder with a condition? We need to be working with our partners. We need to be working with our justice partners, and we need to have a stronger understanding of who we're dealing with and what we're doing and why we're doing it. The goal is community safety and well-being. The goal is to make people, is to work as a system to not fail. And by the time someone's incarcerated, multiple systems have failed them over and over again. And those systems are often not related to justice, but land injustices in hands in the end. The concept of law enforcement public health is really blending these two things, giving the police officers and the frontline individuals an understanding of who they're dealing with, why they're dealing with, and how they can be better. It's an opportunity to not only work with policing, but corrections. I think we oftentimes forget about the correction side of things, because once somebody gets locked up, they just become locked up. And I think we need to really move this public health concept, not only through frontline police officers, but individuals who are working in carceral settings, so that we can truly have that trauma-informed lens to try to do a better job of ensuring that people get what they need, and remembering that this is 100% about people. There's roughly 20,000 people incarcerated in Canada every single day. 100% of those people have contact with the police, and 100% of those people have contact with correctional people. And we need to understand that these individuals are human beings, and we need to go human-centered design. We need to also understand that oftentimes, from a policing perspective, we deal with someone in chapter 7 of their life, and we don't ever think about chapters 1 through 6 and how they got there. And that's one of the things that we need to get our members understanding, is that we're dealing with people in a single point of time, and that we can't give them the label of criminal, because people aspire to the label that they're given based on labeling theory. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I think this is an opportunity for us to move forward in a positive way. I think this opportunity has been accelerated by the killing of George Floyd. And I don't think I hope never happens. And I hope we can ensure that, 30 years from now, there's not some police officer who decided to go back to school late in life talking about police reform and evolution. And I don't think we want to lose this opportunity for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I value that trope of not reform, but evolution. And we will now evolve to Francesca.
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. So I hope you can see my screen. My name is Francesca Mooney-Kelly. I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Surrey in the UK. And I'm presenting, I've been doing work on the intersection between policing and health for a bit more than a year now. And I was really grateful to the conference organizers for giving me the chance to present today, because I'll take this as an opportunity to give some shape and hopefully some coherence to some of the ideas and thoughts I've had about this in the last year or so. And before I start, just two disclaimers. So when I say policing, I will always mean policing as done by the police. And the other thing is, I will rely quite heavily on criminological research, and because I think what really sparked my interest in this is that we need health and law enforcement to come closer together, but sometimes these two partners do not necessarily speak the same language. And as a criminologist, I think that the discipline has a lot to offer for productive and fruitful cooperation between these two domains. So what I'm going to do today, so I will tell you where we are with a particular reference to the context of England and Wales, which is a bit different from the situation that you have in North America. I'll talk about some of the opportunities that the intersection of policing and health brings together, but also some of the challenges. And then I will conclude. I'm not able to offer you any conclusions, any findings, but I can give you some awkward questions. And I'm hoping that this session today can be the start of us together trying to come up with some decent, solid answers to these questions. So where are we now? I'm preaching to the converted here. So we know more and more law enforcement and health professionals are working side by side. It just makes sense and it works. They work together to address complex, stubborn problems that often affect a relatively small part of the population, which is a small part of the population who's in great need of help. But obviously, context matters, and this may be the most obvious statement you will have heard at the end of this conference. But where we are in the world matters a great deal, and particularly in England and Wales, I think there is a long history of partnership working, multi-agency working that kind of shapes the state of practice at the moment. So statutory requirements for joint working between health and police date all the way back to 1989. They were strengthened at the end of the 90s. So there is a long history of police being used to working with other agencies. The other thing that we need to take into account is austerity, and essentially the fact that starting in 2010, subsequent Conservative governments have decided that they needed to slash public spending, and this has affected all public sector agencies, police, health, local authorities. No one has any money. So, from a practical point of view, it did make sense to try and come together to continue to provide services despite the very consistent cuts to budgets. And then also the other thing that we need to take into account is the longer standing shift that happened in British policing in the last maybe 15 years towards the proactive management of problems, so concerns to do with risk, harm, and threat, and the consequent emergence of a vulnerability agenda, so that police in England and Wales are now working a lot on things like missing people, mental health, child sexual exploitation, modern slavery, violence against women and girls, and not necessarily so focused on, for example, volume crime, which was a staple of policing in England and Wales in the late 90s, early 2000s. And just to give you a sense of, how lively, how active work is in this area, here you can see documents by the NPCC, the National Police Chiefs Council, about public health approaches in policing, with the College of Policing, which is the agency that sets the standards for British policing, Public Health England, Public Health Wales, the Home Office, which is the government agency, which is ultimately responsible for policing in England and Wales. And the one thing that I think is really, really interesting in this is that we find a clear definition of what public health approaches to policing should entail. So a population approach, let's not focus on individuals, but groups of people. Let's look at the underlying causes of criminal behavior. We know that there is a great degree of overlap with the determinants of poor health. So tackling them can also lead to positive health outcomes. Move to prevention, the reliance on data, the evidence base, evaluation, outcomes, and the fact that we need to work together in partnerships with communities to identify the local problems and hopefully, potentially, local solutions to these problems. And obviously, so I think this is a great development with the potential to make a great change in the life of people who are in great need of help. This has made it possible to shift attention more towards hidden forms of victimization. This has been instrumental in engaging with incredibly hard to reach constituencies. And so I've been observing the work of a police and health partnership in an English local authority for the last 18 months or so. And I have seen firsthand the positive impact that, productive cooperation between police and health can make to the lives of individuals who have been turned down and have had doors shut in their face, basically for their entire adult life. So this works, but it's great. But I think from a chronological perspective, there are some things that we need to pay a bit more attention of if we want this cooperation to flourish, and also to be sustainable in the long term. And there's two challenges particularly that I'd like to very briefly talk about. And the first one is, the potential tension between the reliance on data, evaluation, risk factors, what we could call expert knowledge. And on the other hand, particularly in the English context, we have the increasing involvement of experts by experience in these interventions and programs. And by these, I mean people who have, who are known to the criminal justice system, who have experienced homelessness in their life, mental health problems, drug addiction, etc., etc. And on one hand, you could argue that when these two systems of knowledge go together and they say the same thing, it's great. But what happens if they do not? It could be that epistemologically they might be incompatible. So I think we need to pay more attention to how to solve conflicts if and then when they arise between these two systems. And we know, there is a lot of research on the risks of over-reliance on expert knowledge in crime control, because we need crime control to be democratic. We need people to be involved in the production of the policing policies and policing strategies that affect them. So this is one side. And on the other hand, we know that if involving these individuals in these partnerships, in this work, is just window dressing, that's not going to come to any good. And again, in terms of the democratic character of these interventions, that would leave much to be desired. In terms of involving communities, again, it's really, really hard to decide who gets to speak for a specific community. How do we identify, who the spokespeople are? And what happens, again, when communities do not agree? There is no agreement at the local level on what the problems are and what the solutions might be. There are also some more contingent challenges here. Obviously, the C word, COVID-19, it has disrupted a lot of things everywhere in the world, but it has also given the opportunity to practitioners, both from the police and health, to really come together and try to help people at a time of great need. But obviously here the threat is that needs have deepened, and it's really, really hard for police and health to actually, provide support to all those that need it. Specifically in the English context, there is also a problem with conflicting policy directives and the fact that up until the current Home Secretary came into office, there was a very much a strong degree of support on the part of the Home Office towards public health approaches to crime, to violent crime, knife crime in particular. And Priti Patel, the current Home Secretary, she does not share this enthusiasm, and she's a lot more keen to go back to more aggressive forms of policing, more reactive and, let's say that, forms of policing. So there is also a need, on one hand, police forces from chief constables down are very keen to keep working on this. But at the same time, if the Home Office says you now need to do something else completely, their hands will be a bit tied. Okay, so I'm aware that I've breezed through a lot of this stuff, but I really want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. And what I would like to do with this last slide is really just offering you some awkward questions that I think, as people who believe in the potential for health and police to come together, questions that we need, one, to acknowledge, and hopefully together at some point be able to answer. So first of all, what should the role of the police be? Because there is a lot of talk now about vulnerability, about harm, about providing help to those in need, which is great, but this is not what traditionally the police was supposed to be about. So is this something that, are we advocating for a radical transformation of the role of the police? If that's the case, great. But again, this is something that I think we should be put out in the open. Relatedly, if the police are no longer, the people that deal with crime, and we know there is 50 years of policing research that says crime is really not a lot, does not account for a lot of the time in police work. But then, is crime still an important concept for policing? I'm a criminologist, so obviously I would say hopefully yes. But there is some people in the discipline that say maybe we should think about harm, and think about harm in terms of the concept that really shapes people's lives, life opportunities, and also the outcomes that they have when they interact with social systems. The other thing that I would really like us to think about is, if we are advocating for a radical transformation in the role of the police, maybe it is time for us to involve the public and ask them if this is something that they want, if this is something that they have any opinions about. And obviously, there is a great, this doesn't mean that we should be slaves to public opinion, but I think this is something that the public, that citizens, communities should be involved in, given the institutional, legal, and also symbolic relevance of the police. The police mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I think it is about time to have an open conversation about how to move forward, and to accept that maybe some things need to change, some things may stay as they are, and that whatever we decide, this should be a process where public deliberation and the participation of all those affected, both on the side of community, but also on the side of police officers, where everyone is involved and gets a chance to speak. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We now have an almost unprecedented development in my time as a moderator, which is to say 2 speakers in a row have used less than their fully allotted time. So that allows me, with that excellent example of precision and expedition, to turn this over to a loquacious Dutchman, Auggie van Dijk. Auggie, take it away.
All right, thank you, Scott. As you said, I am from the Netherlands, and I'm a strategist with the Dutch police. Just saying this because Francesca rightly said it's important where you're coming from. So in my context, the context will be close to the intertalk with Francesca about the UK. Netherlands is very close to that. At the same time, I want to take a look at the US to make clear what are actually the awkward questions, and I take that from you as well, Francesca, we are dealing with. I want to look into whether law enforcement and public health as an emerging field has a future. So, and what it depends on. Looking back, I'm going to start with quoting myself actually, and Nick Cross from the article in 2017, where we said, well, law enforcement and public health are, sort of uneasy bedfellows, right? Law enforcement and public health have long been separate domains, only sporadically cooperating, and then often reluctantly. And traditionally, law enforcement was tied closely to public order, intelligence on subversives, and criminal investigations. And this indicates that law enforcement always has to be understood with the society, politics, governance, and the wider criminal justice system in mind. And then typically, we said at that time, law enforcement as public policing has not been at all geared at an explicit public health role, except perhaps in a major health crisis with public order element, such as an epidemic or other emergency. Well, little did we know. It's it's actually very interesting, as the previous speakers has already said, how the pandemic brings out, exactly this question: what is the role of policing? I believe, like Scott said, it is an important point in time for the future of law enforcement and public health, both as a practice and as a way forward. And I think the future pathways are uncertain at the moment. So on the one hand, it's clear that the picture I was just painting about, these separate fields has altered considerably in recent decades, due to improved knowledge, technological innovation, societal change, social movements, and legislation, which has aided in drawing both agencies closer together in a number of societies. And obviously, this conference is a great example of that. And at the same time, it was referred to as well, there are at times strong incentives to further separate public health and law enforcement. The Home Office in the UK was mentioned, but probably more telling at the moment was the dealing with the COVID pandemic and the related killing of George Floyd and the related defunding to police movement, which you could say one of the central presumptions could be in this discourse is that law enforcement and public health maybe should be clearly separated. Well, I'm going to take a look at law enforcement and public health to start with from a policing perspective. So what does it look like from a policing perspective? Well, first, the police have been struggling to position themselves in a fundamentally changed context in the 21st century. And we've seen that all around, and it led to reorganizations in many countries, but the exact role has not crystallized yet. And I do think there is a very real possibility related to austerity and to other factors, that policing will become narrowly defined in the context of, again, criminal justice and public order, and will retreat from their social service role, especially in times of austerity. Alternatively, policing could be redefined in the wider context of public health and safety. So this is what LAPH is about, and whether this future becomes reality might at least in part depend on the fitness of the LAPH approach given current and future health and safety context. So are we changing the business then? The very good piece of Friedman on disaggregating the police function states, to reduce the harms of policing, we need to reimagine public safety from the ground up. And one could argue that the emerging field of law enforcement and public health is an attempt to do just that, not by coming up with a new institutional blueprint, but by proposing joined up solutions. LAPH as an emerging field is based on the partial overlap of the goals, methods, and target population of both domains. And related to that, obviously, is the stance that joined up solutions are called for. And for me, important for the sustainability of the field is that these should go beyond traditional cooperation between the two domains to be more than just, something at the borders, as it were, of the core businesses. So what is then, where do we need to look if we look for the relevant qualitative change? I think we can look at a number of, or at different levels of analysis. So to start with, probably the most important level to date, it's all the practices at the intersection of law enforcement and public health. And they truly are the foundation of LAPH as an emerging field. And lots of examples around that we've seen in this conference. Then the next level up, I think, is the importance of boundary spanning professionals who are crafting actually this new field as they try and make things work. And I see this leading also to new kind of functions and new kinds of jobs, new ways of organizing. So this taps into the third level, which is important, I think. And this is, changing the involved professions? And with regard to policing, is policing becoming a profession to begin with, right? But is it changing the professions? And do we see that in education and training to begin with? And again, meeting last night on the importance of evidence-based and vulnerability and how to translate that in curriculum for police officers and health professionals is a very important sign of that. But also, how does it translate? And I'm again talking from a policing perspective, to the organizational structure, the governance, and the culture. And then next level would be, what is the policing function then? And this is what Francesco related to already. And then the last level would be, what about the state and related institutions? Well, I'm going to take one step back and going to look at the policing function. Now, just as an example, as something that is important if we want to make the step to, having LAPH as a definitive field which is sustainable in the future. So we need to I will take a very quick look at the functions of the police, what I call late modernity, right? We're looking at what is the importance of policing in the current context. And if we go back, obviously, quoting one of the Peel principles, the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. Policing, however, and that's, is probably much more what Punch said, a secret social service. It's not so secret anymore. And this is up to date, as someone referred already to, the colors of policing, or I think it was Francesca again, but also in the US, Neustetter with their research into the 911 calls. It's not about crime, it is policing as a social service. And we see different conceptualizations of policing coming up in terms of harm reduction, vulnerability, or public health policing, all things we are all here very familiar with. I then look, and then I take inspiration from what is happening in England, in Wales, the strategic review of policing that's going on there, and a good piece by, I think, Ian Loader, where he actually says, well, all right, so looking at this new development, I'll quote him here, the protection and safeguarding of vulnerable individuals, whether as victims or exploited and traumatized offenders, clearly requires partnership between various agencies and an overarching ambition that is oriented not simply to order and safety, but to well-being more generally. But it's sometimes, and I keep on quoting, it's sometimes rather difficult when reading the literature outlining or promoting proactive preventive activity, a whole of system approach or related variants of public health policing to discern exactly why the police are involved and where the proper limits of their role are supposed to lie. This question, he understands, says, stands in much need of reflection and clarification. So I totally agree with that. So looking from a policing perspective, if we want to sort of take a new route, so what is it then that defines the role of policing in this whole of society partnership context? I'll give a short try. And this is related to work I've been doing with Gary Gardner and Clifford Shearing on the pandemic, of which I tried to talk yesterday. What we said basically is, and this is sort of consistent with a late modern perspective, returning to the classics. So we return to Bittner and to the conception that policing basically is a mechanism for the distribution of non-negotiably coercive force employed in accordance with the dictates of the intuitive grasp of situational exigencies. So where does this lead us? This leads us to the police having the role, to address all sorts of human problems when and insofar as their solution do or may possibly require the use of force at the point of their occurrence. And then finally, the famous quote, when do we call the police? We call upon the police to assist, as when something is happening that ought not to be happening and about which someone had better do something now. So this is classical stuff. Is this conception related then to like we were talking about before, to a crime and disorder in itself? Is it related to something like the criminal justice system? Not necessarily, I think. It's not necessarily about crime and disorder. And refer to another title by Bittner, Florence Nightingale in Pursuit of Willie Sutton, which is a very nice way of catching this. And also looking to early work, people like Banton, who makes the distinction between law officers and peace officers. Peace officers actually being, the important brand here. So if policing is primarily seen as part of the criminal justice system, this translates in policy, culture, and structure, and technologies and attitudes that are detrimental to the things we want to reach. So, even where there was a sort of strong connection with the criminal justice system, this was always countered also in the US by ideas around, community policing. But, in the end, when there's pressure on the system, police gets back on the foot of crime and disorder. And, sort of to echo what Francesca was saying. So are public health policing and crime fighting, for example, are they two different functions or are they one? We need to think about that, because otherwise, if we're not careful, it will not be sustainable, into the future. I think, not just because of austerity, but also because of changing circumstances. All right, do we need to reinvent government again? So can we do without criminal law? Yeah, well, I think probably. Can we do without non-negotiable force, including what is happening online? I think probably not. So we need to recognize that the potential use of force is why the police are involved in the first place. And so if we deny that or try to sort of bury that along like very nice intentions of community well-being, it won't fly, I think. At the level of state security, especially in the context of datification, concepts are changing fast at the moment. So we're not looking at criminal acts anymore and prosecution. It's much more about disrupting networks with data. We go from centrality of laws to importance of transparency, accountability, oversight in multi-agency settings. And so we should make same changes when it comes to the very concrete police work. I would say that it is important to loosen the police from the criminal justice system. In fact, don't make them part of a system at all. Everything that can be unambiguously be regulated or organized should not be an issue for the public police. The police step in if it's not organized yet, and something happens that ought not to be happening. And they need to signal and advise what's needed to prevent this from happening in the future and who should be involved. I come to my conclusion. So obviously, we want to go to community safety and well-being, and non-negotiable force, is or should not be part of a subsystem, but should be an aspect of different systems based on a negotiated conception of the public good. Coupling the police to specific system and referring to the brilliant titles of the book. Sorry?
Sorry, just finishing up.
I am. Thank you. So referring to the brilliant titles of the books by Richard Erickson, Making Crime and Reproducing Order, this is what happens if we try to put in policing within the system. Legitimacy is at stake in reproducing unjust order and failing to predict the vulnerable. And this has become more important for the state as well. So truly developing a LAPH profession in solving all sorts of human problems with the explicit recognition that non-negotiable force might be required. This implies, by the way, a police which is characterized by restraint, accountability, and a minimalist perspective. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Achie. Well, we come to our last speaker. I've been thinking about Dan's starting point with evolution, not reform. And of course, in the context of the other conversations, realizing that one characteristic of evolution is it's pretty hard to see. It goes pretty slowly and pretty broadly. And the rest of our speakers have been trying to get at the question of what that evolution looks like. What does a new police force look like? Augie has talked about a kind of conceptual piece of this puzzle, which is we should basically understand the core of what police do and have them do nothing else, which is a starting point. Brandon, I think, Brandon Del Pozo, who, if I was speaking German, I would have to introduce as Mr. Dr. Chief Brandon Del Pozo, to capture all his different present and past roles, is going to offer us some new metrics and steps forward in reforming or evolving police. So Brandon, please take it away.
Hey, thanks. I'm just making sure everybody can hear me. Yes, good,
We
great.
can hear you and we
So-
can see your slides.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that Alka talked about Bittner, because I thought I'd start with Bittner just to remind us how long it's been and how, frankly, how little progress we made, right? So this is the functions of the police in modern society, right? It was written by Bittner. I'm not going to tell you how many years ago. That's the punchline. But this is from the introduction, right? And it's worth reading in its entirety. He's talking about a big crisis in policing after decades of stagnation, despite these widely acknowledged advances. And he's talking about advances in criminology, police science, police practice. The police continue to project as bad an image today as they have in the past. In fact, the voices of criticism seem to have increased. The traditional critics have been joined by academic scholars and some highly placed judges. Certain segments of American society, notably the ethnic minorities and the young people who have only recently acquired a voice in the public debate, express generally hostile attitudes towards the police. At the same time, news about rising crime rates and widely disseminated accounts about public disorders, ranging from peaceful protest to violent rebellion, contribute to the feeling that the police are not adequately prepared to face the tasks that confront them. So if I were to put this up in a class full of undergraduates today, they would say this is written by an old person, a boomer, who is watching TV this summer and using anachronistic language to describe exactly what's happening now. I think a lot of us would agree. I see from the people who I can see that they're smiling or at least nodding. This was written 50 years ago in 1970, right? This was written about the 50s and 60s, looking backwards in the 70s about the crisis in policing. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is that this monograph by Bittner, which is, and everything I think when we talk about the role of police to some extent is a footnote back to Bittner, was fully funded by the National Institutes of Health. There was a time when the National Institutes of Health was going to criminologists and they didn't call, I don't know if they called it an R01 at the time or a center grant, but they said, it's in the public's interest to fund health research at the intersection of policing and public health, right? And so one of the arguments I think we're going to make, and it's very important to answer the awkward questions that Francesca talks about and to do the reconceptualization that Alka talks about, but the difficulties of doing so is not an excuse not to bring health research, policing research and criminal justice research back into the health realm, right? And to get to a point where the NIH is funding people like Egon Bittner again to help conceptualize and solve these problems. So I want to go back to Nancy Cass's 2001 article on the ethics of public health. She, one of the formative articles of framing and ethics construal of public health is written by Cass. She's now at Johns Hopkins. This is in 1991. But in it, she remarks, the state's authorities to pass laws to improve the public health dates to the 19th century and is referred to as the police power, right? Coercive action under state authority to encourage educational efforts, ellipsis, seize property, close businesses, destroy animals, or involuntary treat or even lock away individuals. These various public health tools and functions, while together successful in decreasing morbidity and mortality, nonetheless raise important ethical questions, right? So when I am in these spaces where we're duking it out between policing and public health, and I'm saying we need a partnership, and people are saying, no, it's public health's job to circumscribe and limit policing and go all the way upstream to the structural determinants. I go back to the seminal ethics of public health article that says, hey, folks, like you exercise police powers. One of the things I'll say by way of observation is that I sort of disagree with Bittner about the recourse to force. My dissertation is about this, right? Everybody's got a dissertation laying around somewhere that makes all of their sticking points. I feel that like public health is an extraordinarily regulatory regime. It is about regulating health. I've never met a public health practitioner that wasn't willing to pass a law or get federal money to create an infrastructure to regulate behavior, right? But I think that one of the advantages that public health has is that they're operating so far upstream that the nudges and the coercion and the imposition of will is much more distal. It's on industries, it's on systems, it's on concepts, rather than the proximate interventions that police respond to when they're responding to what Egon Bittner did call is the need to do something right now about something that's actually happening. But I see them as in the same family and continuum of regulation of risk behavior. When you go to the New York City charter, where the New York City Police Department is given its duties, it is specifically instructed to guard the public health, right? That's one of its core duties. It's in the third line. It's right next to regulating sidewalks and parks and places and dispersing unlawful assemblages. And some of the language in here is, anachronistic, like about mendicants and beggars, but it talks about that natural congruence between policing and public health. And then when you talk about modern ways of thinking of it, right? We have the chief of New Haven, Connecticut, saying very succinctly, while many think that the primary responsibility of the police is to arrest and enforce laws, for us in New Haven, our primary responsibility is the protection and preservation of life, right? And if you ask and Francesca alluded to this, if you ask what public health is in the business of, it's the population level reduction of morbidity and mortality to create healthier and more resilient communities. So one of the things I asked the audience to think about is the extent to which one of our main obstacles is in what the philosophy of science you call an incommensurability problem, where the police have become habitually or conceptually entrapped in talking about crime and talking about statutory violations, in measuring their success by the number of guns seized, the number of kilos taken off the street, the number of arrests made. But if you were to ask them at the end of the day what they're really doing, they'd probably give you an answer like Chief Reyes gives. And they're coming pretty close to saying that they're in the business of public health, dealing with a certain subset of risk behaviors, right? And I think that getting to that meshing of concepts and then bringing policing to the table, where when police chiefs are hired, when budgets are set, when police departments are evaluated, when reform efforts are constructed, when we're reconceptualizing the work, as Daniel alluded to, that police be forced to talk in a commensurable language with public health that gets them, and I'll talk about this in a moment more, to the true endpoints of public health in terms of the police practice, right? So this goes back to 1995. I think Scott actually sent me this article. I don't remember. So I'd like to, in my finer moments, I claim that I found it doing my own research, but I think Scott was like, Brandon, check this article out. Mark Moore at Harvard in 1995, like really, when you go back and look at the research, this is one of the first explicit attacks on the incommensurability problem, where he begins in his abstract and the early on by saying, to the criminal justice community, interpersonal attacks are viewed as crimes. So the public health community, they're viewed as intentional injuries. These distinctions make for a world of difference, right? So we begin to see this effort to like untangle the incommensurability problem by looking at, we're both addressing the same issues in policing and public health, but it's the language that leads us down different paths. There is these two scholars, Evan Anderson and Scott Burris, who remind us that it's not quite the right analogy between policing and public health, that maybe public health has a lot to do with medicine. Sorry, maybe policing has more to do with medicine than with public health per se, just because the actors are proximate to the problems. They're working at the individual level. They aggregate to net public health effects, but maybe the work itself can best be framed more in terms of medicine. And I think that's instructive as we think about the way forward with policing and public health. Scott and Evan's research talks about focus on acute needs, proximate needs. It's very patient-centered. Doctors will grouse about their inability to deal with the upstream structural determinants of health. I'm getting people who are encouraged to smoke. I'm getting people who are encouraged to eat poorly. I'm getting people who make all of these poor health decisions as part of the environments they're in. And then I'm asked to treat their diabetes and their lung cancer and all of their health problems and obesity as a doctor. Police say very much the same thing about the situations they respond to, right? people grow up in with bad educational opportunities, in neighborhoods where there's a lot of ACE, right? Where there's a lot of childhood trauma and adversity. There's all sorts of problems going on. We did not prescribe 10 trillion opioid analgesics to everybody and create the opioid epidemic of today, but yet we're dealing with the downstream effects. So this is very neat medical analogy that can help us frame the police public health evolution. But then I'll remind you, speaking of Sherman, another person we can't talk, we have to talk about when we talk about this, is that he reminds us that if medicine is in fact the basis of evidence-based policing for public health, sorry, going backwards here. Let me get the slides right. That evidence in medicine wasn't always the holy grail that we think it is. I'll try to get these slides properly done here. Sorry, I'm jumping all around. But what he's saying is that, here we go. Medicine, in fact, this is in 1998 when the Police Foundation paid for Larry Sherman to try to bring evidential practice into policing. He says, well, the logical place to look is medicine, because the newest trend in medicine, the biggest fad, is evidence-based medicine. And I think a lot of folks in policing will shake our head and say, was there ever a time where medicine was resistant to evidence? Well, if you ask Larry Sherman doing his research, the answer is yes, right? Medicine, in fact, seems just as resistant to the use of evidence to guide practice as are fields with lower educational requirements, such as policing. Then he goes on to cite the National Institute of Health. So what we need here is a recognition that, like, police aren't alone in resisting evidence. We're just maybe decades behind, that we're dealing with the same types of downstream effects as doctors are dealing with, that they aggregate into public health outcomes. And that if we follow, innovation and reform in medicine, maybe we have a good blueprint for innovation and reform in public health. So this is a paper that just came out. I'm sorry that I didn't correct the word objective properly in the upper right-hand corner, but this is in a Journal of Community, yes, I was very embarrassed, Journal of Community Safety and Wellbeing table on a paper Leo Boletsky, Jeremiah Gulka, and I wrote about the reframing the metrics and measures of policing around public health to get better reform effects. I won't go through them one by one, but one thing that I came up independently and then found out Scott Burris did it already, but iatrogenesis is an underutilized concept in policing. Police call a lot of what they do collateral consequences, bad outcomes. If we accept that policing intends to be an intervention that reduces community level morbidity and mortality, and that police intend to improve health effects in a community, a lot of what they do can be reframed as iatrogenesis, right? And that acknowledges the intentions of policing while also forcing police to acknowledge the harms that a lot of their interventions lead to. The only other thing I want to draw your attention to here is something that Leo Boletsky and I were working out, which is the difference between surrogate and true endpoints. I've alluded to that. Policing, as I've said, and I saw Alka nodding, it talks about arrests made, contraband seized, tickets issued, the number of robberies, et cetera, et cetera. In medicine, we call these surrogate endpoints, right? And in public health, what we need to hold policing to are the true actual endpoints, right? Which are lower levels of community violence, lower levels of morbidity, of mortality, of risk behaviors, of overdose, right? The things that actually serve to show that policing is contributing to more resilience and health in our communities. A little thing, I'll skim through, I don't know how much time we have, but you can treat the stop, question, and frisk problem in New York City not only as a problem of constitutional law, you can treat it as a number needed to treat problem. The number needed to treat is the idea of how many interventions are required to produce a negative effect that the treatment is intended to stop, right? So if you look at stop, question, and frisk, they frisked 540,000 people in 2008. 90% were innocent. They didn't even need the treatment. 1.7% had any type of contraband. 1.1% had the most acute thing you were starting to get to, which is serious weapons. 0.15% had a firearm. This is all to achieve the surrogate endpoint of fewer weapons, to try to achieve the true endpoint of less community violence. If we were just talking about this in terms of medicine and public health, stop, question, and frisk has an acute number needed to treat problem. It's very hard to justify as an intervention. You consider the number of people you need to treat to get the outcome you're looking for. And it would be really interesting to hold police accountable for this type of analysis. There's a lot of really kind of weak ecological research going on that I think we need to get away from. We've heard that police contribute to a 1% increase in preterm births, that they reduce sleep. There's that if somebody is killed by the police in your community, you're less likely to use a condom in the following year, right? I mean, I just say that these broach the question of police iatrogenic harms, but I think we need to have a much more robust, like stronger research into what the proximate harms of policing are, in the intervention in the immediate aftermath, just as a cautionary tale. I point to this STI study and it properly acknowledges its limitations, but then it does say in 2014 and 2015, if someone was killed in your community by the police, and in 2016, you're less likely to use a condom. That's the association it's making. Like, we need to get much more robust research to that, and that comes from what Alka and Scott and all these folks call for, which is a center for policing and public health, right? That really brings together the research, translates it into practice, brings practitioners in and equips them with the means to understand what they're doing out there and to adhere to a better public health set of metrics, right? And I think the last thing I'll say as I stop sharing is that, when I talked about, and I'm trained in political philosophy, and I said that the police have three powers. One is in roles. One is to protect and rescue people from proximate physical harms of all kinds, right? That's the protect and rescue function, whether it's violent crime, whether it's a building collapse, whether it's a pandemic, right? They're part of that protect and rescue infrastructure. They turn, I'm on overtime. Thank you, Scott. So I'll skip that. The second thing the police do is they broker and enforce the fair terms of social cooperation in public spaces, whether it's roadways, sidewalks, parks. I could talk more about that in the question and answer session. And the last thing is they collect evidence and they collect people and bring them to a judge for adjudication. We focus on that. It's the least interesting and democratically important in some ways of the three. So what I'd like to do is align policing, public health, I'll say in the last 30 seconds, public health's police powers, which they seem to be uncomfortable with, are what empowers public health to solve health-related problems at the population level. In policing, enforcing the law is an end in itself. We need to reframe policing's power under the law, not as a duty to enforce, but empowers policing to engage in problem-solving exercises that increase health and resilience at the population level. Sometimes that's incarceration, sometimes that's prosecution. Most of the time, it's not. That's sort of the gist of where I'd like to head. Very gracious of you to give me some extra time. Thank you.
All right, everybody, now use your raise hand function, and Alyssa behind the scenes will put you up for your question. Alyssa, have we got anybody yet?
Sorry, not so far. There have been kind of questions in the chat.
We'll give people a chance to get excited here. We definitely had an evolution. I loved your table, even with the misspelling, Brandon. I think that it's very nice to begin to see, well, let's do this instead of that. Let's call it this instead of that. Let's measure this instead of that. I think your point about the lack of funding and the role of NIH, that fits right into the whole legal epidemiology movement that I've been, involved in lately. Evan Anderson and I will have a piece out in the New England Journal about that, about the need for NIH to start funding legal epidemiology research again. But I think that old story is powerful. They've done it before, they can do it again. So maybe I can ask each of you just to say, can you give me sort of a concrete thing that police would do differently tomorrow if you were in charge, that represents, an example of what we should be looking for in this otherwise invisible evolution?
Do you mind if I just answer that? Because I see Jennifer Carroll, who's my colleague and friend, has also put a raft of objections to my talk, and I think I can answer them at the same time. She correctly notes that, like, the police are used to visit severe harms on people, to restrict civil rights, to oppress, minoritized communities. She's correct about all of that. I think one of the problems we have with policing is that it's the tip of a very broad and deep spear of government coercion. I mean, and if you think the government isn't coercive in other ways, try to build a house without getting the government's permission. Try to start a business without getting the government's permission. If you keep on ignoring the government again and again and again, the government will be at the door of your house or your business, like forcing you to do something. And so the problem with the police, if you have the type of society we're in now with its structural racism and its deep injustices, and you're looking to exert coercion on minoritized communities, the proximate tip of that spear is what you use to do it, and that's policing, right? I don't deny that any of that happens, and that's why we're here today with all of those problems. To get away from that, I guess I took a sojourn into ideal theory, right? To talk about what the police should ideally be used for in a democracy. So nothing that Jennifer says in the chat box is wrong. It's sort of the tragedy that policing has been co-opted for. To say what I'd ask police to do differently today, I'll kind of pervert that question a little bit and say, what should we demand of police today? I have this fantasy of a chief of police candidate being in front of a mayor and a city council, and instead of being asked, what will you do to increase community policing? Or what will you do to reduce violent crime? I would want a plan in order to get hired to say, what will you do to align your police department's goals with the city's public health goals? What steps will you take when you get your job to show how you can work with your colleagues, offload certain responsibilities, shift certain budgets around, and change your priorities to achieve the endpoint of better health and resilience in our community? That would deprive the police chief candidate of talking about this like very shape-shifting concept of community policing, and deprive the candidate of talking about, well, I'm going to like start a drug task force and I'm going to start a gun task force. No. Let's talk about what that's going to do to increase health. I'd love to see that job interview rather than the community policing job interview that we give police chief candidates now.
I also want to highlight something in carrying on this line of thinking about change, and maybe going to you, Ache, that, but it's also something that Francesca talked about, I think. Well, you all talked about it. That's a point that Jennifer Carroll makes in the chat, which reminds very much of something, a wonderful article by my old law professor, Bob Cover, who emphasized the link between violence and the law, and particularly the fact that when it comes down to it, the difference between you and the sheriff is the sheriff can kill you. And we have sheriffs killing people all over the place. And while we talk about evolution, which is invisible, and reform, which is constant but never changes anything, can we get away with this level of abstraction, or do we have something much more tangible to offer the world about what a law enforcement and public health world looks like that's different from the current world?
I'm trying to understand your question, Scott. So obviously, like I said, the use of non-negotiable force is important, and obviously it is the thing that distinguishes, I think, policing in many ways from the other professions. Obviously, you don't want the police to use violence. The idea is that it is an unstructured situation and you've got no one else to call. And to make it very concrete, and show the difference and what the difference is with police specifically being in the criminal justice system, looking at COVID-19 and the response of the police. So what I saw, and I'll just go to the Netherlands then obviously there was a big issue. There needed to be response to COVID-19. And the main demands on policing were actually about enforcing regulations, which was, I thought, really, really stupid, because the police were in a position to actually contribute to lots of things that needed to be done in that circumstances. But the lens, also from the police itself, was specifically related to, law enforcement, instead of, going into the communities and see what is needed there at this moment and contribute. So one of the things that gets in the way there is that this is the idea that the police has got specific tasks, right? So one of the reasons the police is reluctant in those situations is also because they think, well, the moment we step in, it's on us, right? It's our responsibility, and it is there to stay. I don't think that is, the way we should look at policing any longer, right? So it is specifically, and that is, in the Bittner formulation about a non-negotiable force. The important part is not non-negotiable force. The important part is how to behave within the context of specific context and understanding what's happening there and contributing there. So this leads to a different perspective, I think, of the police and policing. One last thing, what we saw is that, for example, also in the Netherlands, policing still looked at, the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice as the most important department. Well, it was stupid. It was a health crisis, right? So why not look at the other departments as well? Why is it so difficult to bring that together? So I would change that, and I think the police has a responsibility in signaling that and taking a position in that.
Well, I guess on that measure, we ought to maybe just think about paying police officers as much as we pay surgeons or emergency room docs, because they have the hardest job, and we want them to be the best trained, best rewarded people. Francesca or Dan? And Francesca, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, but so thank you very much for this super interesting conversation. And I think, obviously, as an academic, I always feel a bit uncomfortable in, what should we do now or next? Because I think, we're trained in identifying problems, not necessarily in providing solutions. But I think a very interesting, two interesting points that I think I can make from based on in the British context is that I think the great strength that we have here is that we have, most police forces still believe, or at least pay lip service to policing by consent. And the idea that policing is not about force. Most police officers here do not carry guns. And the idea is that you have, unless you engage on a meaningful level with your community, you cannot police them. And obviously, traditionally, the community was white middle class people, which is not sustainable, wrong on so many levels. So I think, trying to engage on a substantive level with more diverse, more fragmented communities. And this is hard. It takes skills that police officers are not taught. So it's something that you may be good at, but, luck if you are, too bad if you're not. And it's not something that I think is seen as important in police forces. If you do community engagement work, sometimes that's seen like the kiss of death. But I think, looking at what's happened with COVID here, obviously what we hear about are, and I think Oki talked about this, the people who were fined for meeting for a coffee outside in the park. And the police using drones to shame people from not walking around beauty spots. There was still an effort in trying to engage with people and explain to them what they were doing wrong, or if they were not following the regulations. And enforcement was the last E that they used. And, we know that fines were disproportionately given to people of color, minorities, disadvantaged people that did not have the advantage of a garden. But still, the practice is not great. The idea is there, and I think it's something that we should salvage. And along with that, I think no matter what the Home Office is doing, I think on a practical level, health and police are coming closer and closer together, and they're using the same metrics. So they're not so longer worried about crime rates. Crime rates here are going down anyway. And I think that's a great opportunity, because finally the police is able to think about other problems, because people do not break into houses anymore. People do not steal phones anymore. So we're looking at why is it that, a very specific group of people show up to A&E or ER, I think, over and over again? Why is it that the same group of people, we have to arrest them every weekend because they're drunk and disorderly? And that's where the police can make a difference. And I think, they're trying to do that. And I think that's great.
Dan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I were to be in charge, there's two things I would do. The first one is somehow build in proximity into our police training. And what I mean by that is when we're close to people, we tend to care for them. One of the big issues in society today is a separation between Black, Indigenous, and people of color and the police, resulting in the untold harms that we've talked about. And if we build proximity into our training, into our education, and into how we do things, then we actually become part of the community that we're at. The second thing I would do is actually build in proper outcomes, and I know Brandon talks about this too. Is we measure by way of warrants and how much drug we seize, but as we seize 4 billion kilos of methamphetamines and the price goes down, I'm not an economist, but I understand supply and demand, and we're doing nothing except for celebrating nothing. So it's about what outcomes there are for individual human beings. How do we have a better interaction with individual human beings? And how do we get our membership to understand and be close to? And I can tell you from my own personal experience, the greatest moments in my career are the moments that I've had with people that I've put in jail who have now become my friends. And oftentimes those people impact me significantly more than any award or promotion that's given. It's about human beings and how we interact with those folks. And how do we, if I were the chief of police somewhere, I would build that competence of compassion into policing and try to change the way we look at and engage with folks.
Other questions? Alyssa, are there any hands up?
No hands, but there is one question in the Q&A. I know there's been a lot of discussion about another question in the chat. So just quickly, the question in the Q&A is, as a Dutch citizen, I feel that the Dutch public is very openly commenting on policing and giving their opinion on what they should and shouldn't do. How is the police responding to that in the Netherlands? And should the public be listened to considering context?
That must be a question for me, probably. So, no, I'm thinking. So one of the issues is obviously it's important, and it's that police is still connected to the communities. And in the beginning, of the pandemic, there was some sort of a retreat, but I soon realized, get back in there, because it's more important to be connected. The other thing is that, and that's related to the protests, a specific protest related to also government and police behavior, which, if you're not careful, gets you in sort of a negative spiral around having to use more force and then changing the perspective of policing. That's a very real danger, and I totally agree. There should be lots of dialogue to prevent that.
Well, I think that was our last question. We have come to the what has become the notorious LEPH hard stop 10 minutes before the next session. So I want to thank our active chatting participants for their questions and the many interesting points that were raised in the chats, as well as, of course, to our panel, all of whom have set quite an agenda for whatever we're going to call this, reform or evolution. I think I'm struck in the end by sort of the combination of all these talks in their focus on the fact that it's a hard job to be a police at the bottom. And even if we reserve them to the tiny Bittner job, that's the hardest job out there. And so how do we at once make people have the skill and courage and resources of an emergency doctor, let's say, with a gun, and the ability to treat the people they are encountering in those rare situations as human beings with real potential and real growth, and how do they ultimately see what they do as a healing kind of job? I don't know. That's all kind of hard, but I will, at least start with the chart in Brandon's article, download that and stick it on my wall, so I can push myself towards concreteness in each of those important categories. So once again, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. Thank you for joining us in Philadelphia, if only virtually. And we will see you at the next one.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.